Take a hard look at the tactical map of Eastern Europe right now. The border lines you see are no longer drawn in ink. They are being redrawn in blood and heavy ordnance. We are standing at a pivotal moment, a shift in the landscape that has Western military observers holding their breath. Siversk, a name that stood as a symbol of resilience on the northern Donetsk defense line for over 2 years, has changed color on the operational maps. This is not merely the loss of a dot on a screen. It is the collapse of a strategic linchpin, blowing the doors wide open to the industrial heartland of Ukraine.
On the morning of December 23rd, a cold notification from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine tore through the already tense atmosphere. They confirmed the withdrawal from Siversk. There was no flowery language, no obfuscation. The report admitted a brutal reality. Control of the city was gone. For those who understand the art of war, this public admission carries the weight of 1,000 tons. It marks the end of a prolonged urban defense campaign, where every inch of ground has been churned by tens of thousands of tons of explosives from both sides.
Kyiv's statement painted a picture of a hellscape in Siversk during its final hours. They described a force disparity at a code red level, where the Russian military maintained overwhelming superiority in manpower and heavy equipment. The phrase "fierce fighting" seems too mild to describe what actually transpired. It was, in reality, systematic destruction. Russian forces were not just attacking. They were executing a campaign to level every obstacle with superior artillery fire before their infantry ever stepped foot on the ground.
The core reason for this withdrawal is encapsulated in a steely strategic mindset: force preservation. In a context where Ukraine's manpower is stretched to its absolute limit, holding on to a pulverized city no longer holds military value. The Ukrainian command had to weigh a life-or-death equation: hold the rubble and lose their most elite brigades, or accept a retreat to preserve their core fighting force. They chose the latter, a painful yet lucid and necessary decision.
This is the realization of the military doctrine of defense in depth and force preservation in modern warfare. Land can be retaken, but a battle-hardened unit, if wiped out, leaves a void that cannot be filled for years. The withdrawal from Siversk should not be viewed as a chaotic rout, but as a calculated tactical adjustment designed to avoid encirclement and annihilation, preserving strength for the decisive battles at the next defensive belt. However, to understand why Siversk fell, we must dissect the brutal yet effective tactics of the Russian army. They deployed a multi-layered formation, combining the suffocating pressure of mass numbers with the sophistication of small tactical groups. It wasn't just human waves in frontal assaults. Russia threw flexible assault units into the fray, constantly probing and gouging into the weak points of Ukraine's defense system, creating irreparable cracks along the entire line.
Most notable in the intelligence reports is the heavy presence of guerrilla groups, or more accurately, Russian special reconnaissance units operating deep behind enemy lines. These groups did not just act as spotters for artillery, they directly sowed chaos, cutting off communication lines and vital supply routes. Their presence turned the rear of the Ukrainian defense into an insecure battlefield, degrading combat coordination and collapsing morale from the inside out.
Furthermore, the harsh weather of the Eastern European winter became a potent ally for the attackers. Dense fog and mud significantly limited the observation and mobility of Ukrainian defensive assets, while providing perfect cover for Russian infantry infiltration. In conditions of limited visibility, Ukraine's technological advantage in reconnaissance was neutralized, dragging the war back to its most primal and brutal form of close-quarters infantry combat.
Now, look at the geography of Siversk to understand its lethal importance. Although it is a small municipality with a pre-war population of about 10,000, Siversk is the key that holds the northern gate of Donetsk. Its position forms a natural choke point, guarding the main arterial roads leading south. By losing Siversk, Ukraine didn't just lose a city, they lost a safe buffer zone, forced to retreat to far less favorable defensive positions in the face of mounting pressure.
The fall of Siversk is a hammer blow to Ukraine's interlocking defense structure in the Donbas. It acted as the forward shield protecting the fortress belt of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. These are the two final command and logistical hubs, the heart and brain of all Ukrainian forces in the east. With the Siversk shield shattered, these two strongholds are now exposed to the direct barrels of Russian artillery, placing the entire Donbas defensive campaign on red alert.
The history of combat here shows just how much Russia coveted this position. Since capturing Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in July 2022, the Russian spearhead has always pointed directly at Siversk. The fact that they accepted a stalemate and expended colossal resources for 2 years just to breach this position proves its irreplaceable strategic value. Russia understood that without taking Siversk, they could not safely expand their attack corridor to the south.
Controlling Siversk allows Russia to establish new fire bases and logistical springboards, significantly shortening the distance to their next targets. From here, Russian artillery can extend its reach to control vital supply lines leading into Sloviansk, strangling the flow of equipment and necessities to Ukraine. This is a tactical step setting the stage for larger encirclement campaigns, threatening to cut off northern Donetsk completely from the rest of Ukraine.
The collapse of Siversk did not happen by chance. It was the inevitable result of a classic pincer movement. Data from Deep State and Western intelligence had warned of this danger for weeks. Russian forces persistently captured neighboring areas, tightening the noose step by step, turning Siversk into an isolated pocket. When the two pincers from the north and south began to close, the fate of the defenders inside was sealed. The fall of the Serebryanka area earlier was the first domino to tip, triggering a chain reaction of collapse. With the left flank exposed and retreat routes under Russian fire control, holding the line became a suicide mission. The war map on December 22nd, with red blotches surrounding Siversk, was the clearest evidence of Ukraine's deadlock. They were backed into a corner, with no choice but to retreat or face total annihilation.
Another key factor was the audacious factor by the Russian army to cross the Siversky Donetsk River. Despite extreme risks and heavy casualties, Russia continuously organized river crossings to put troops on the other bank, striking into the flank of the Ukrainian defense. This action demonstrated Moscow's ironclad determination to break this defensive line at any cost. The Siversky River, once a natural moat protecting the city, ultimately could not stop the adversary's momentum.
The moment the withdrawal decision was made, a race against death began. Withdrawing in good order under a rain of enemy fire is one of the most complex and dangerous military maneuvers. Ukraine had to use artillery and drones to run interference, creating a safety corridor for the retreating units. Despite the claim of force preservation, the cost paid on the road of retreat was undoubtedly steep in the face of relentless pursuit. However, the battle for Siversk is not truly over. It has merely shifted to a different form. Ukraine claims they still maintain fire control over the city. This means they have turned Siversk into a deadly gray zone. The city's coordinates have been preloaded into artillery systems. Any Russian attempt to establish bases or depots here will face precise artillery strikes, making Russia's victory incredibly costly. This scorched earth tactic aims to prevent Russia from immediately using Siversk as an offensive springboard. By destroying infrastructure and maintaining fire pressure, Ukraine wants to turn the occupation of Siversk into a logistical burden for the enemy. Russia will have to expend more resources to fortify the position, clear mines, and deal with long-range strikes, slowing down the overall momentum of the campaign.
Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that battlefield momentum is tilting heavily toward Russia. With Siversk in hand, they have removed the most stubborn roadblock in the north. Russian attack vectors are now unleashed to focus their force toward Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. We can forecast a new wave of attacks, more violent and brutal, that will soon crash against these final strongholds in the coming weeks.
The risk of a domino effect collapsing the defensive line is entirely real. If Ukraine does not quickly establish a solid new defense line and halt the Russian adrenaline, they will face a strategic catastrophe. Time is not on Kyiv's side. Every passing day is a day Russia fortifies its position and brings more firepower within range to threaten Ukraine's command centers in the Donbas.
Looking at the broader international context, the fall of Siversk is a deafening alarm bell sent to Western capitals. It exposes the truth that trickle-down military aid is insufficient for Ukraine to stop the massive Russian war machine. The pressure from this defeat is forcing NATO and its allies to act more decisively, shifting from political commitments to concrete and urgent logistical actions to salvage the situation.
The fact that NATO has just activated a second logistics hub in Romania is no coincidence. This is a direct response to the risk of a chain reaction collapse of the Ukrainian front. Establishing a new, large-scale supply artery indicates that the West is preparing for a scenario of prolonged war. They understand that if the flow of ammunition is interrupted for even a single day, the price will be the loss of more strategic cities like Siversk.
Parallel to this, the war is not limited to the front lines, but has expanded to asymmetric strikes. Ukraine is seeking to offset territorial losses by striking deep into the Russian rear. Audacious raids on the Lipetsk airbase or the port of Krasnodar are proof that Kyiv still has fangs. They want to force Russia to pay a price in economics and security right on its own soil, degraded Moscow's ability to sustain the war.
Drone strikes deep inside Russian territory carry a clear strategic message: nowhere is safe. Destroying Su-30 and Su-27 fighters or damaging seaport infrastructure aims to paralyze Russia's military supply chain from a distance. This is Ukraine's way of trying to balance the overwhelming disparity in force, using creativity and technology to confront mass numbers.
On the diplomatic and economic fronts, the war is raging just as fiercely. Europe faces the difficult puzzle of using frozen Russian assets to fund Ukraine, a risky move that could trigger economic retaliation. Meanwhile, shuttle diplomacy efforts by the UK and the US are attempting to find the most advantageous negotiating position for Ukraine before the battlefield situation deteriorates further.
However, all strategic calculations become insignificant in the face of the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Siversk. From a bustling city of 10,000, it is now a desolate graveyard. It is estimated that only a few hundred elderly residents remain, clinging to life in damp basements, living without electricity or water, amidst the roar of bombs. Siversk is dead, in the literal sense of the word, wiped completely from the map of the living.
Satellite images show a horrific level of destruction, where not a single house remains intact. Siversk is now a symbol of the brutal cost of urban warfare, where brick and mortar are mixed with blood and bone. This destruction is a stark reminder that behind the moving arrows on a military map is the disappearance of an entire community, the unhealable pain of thousands of families who have lost their homes and loved ones.
In an overall assessment, the loss of Siversk is an undeniable tactical defeat for Ukraine. However, in the larger picture of a war of attrition, this may be a necessary step back to avoid total collapse. The Ukrainian army chose to preserve its forces to fight another day, rather than sacrifice them in vain for a location that could not be held. It is ruthless, but it is the mandatory clarity of command.
The outlook for the Donetsk front is incredibly bleak and fierce. Russia will certainly not stop. They will leverage their momentum to press Ukraine to the brink. The upcoming battles at the gates of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk will decide the fate of this entire war. This will be the final trial by fire for Ukraine's defensive capabilities and the West's resolve in supporting its ally.
Finally, the story of Siversk leaves us with a profound lesson on the nature of war. Victory does not always belong to the strongest or the bravest, but to those who can endure and sustain their existence the longest. Siversk has fallen, but Ukraine's war for survival continues. In the rubble of today's defeat, the seeds of new strategies are being formed, because in war, as long as the will is not broken, the game is not over.